Dr. Eric Dart is an assistant professor of theology and director for pastoral studies at Gannon University in Erie, PA. So thank you for making the trek. He specializes in the thought of Karl Rahner and contemporary ecumenical theology. Dr. Dart also offers courses on the Catholic tradition, sacraments, theology of marriage, and the Second Vatican Council. He also teaches in the Diocese of Erie's Diaconate Formation Program. Today's topic is, like we said earlier, Church in the World. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Dart.
May, is that okay? That goes there? All right. You're not going to spit in it, are you? Okay. Well, first, it's really good to be here. Excited to engage in a little dialogue, a little conversation about the church and the world. I'll get to the presentation in a moment, but I prefer to do things a little bit more informally. So the way I have it structured is we're going to look at three questions, sort of work together, walk through it. I hope that we can talk, with each other as a group and at our tables interspersed. But I think this idea of church in the world is obviously really pertinent to what we all do as educators. And I know that's a real struggle. There are moments when it kind of feels like, I think we have to be honest, like, what am I doing, right? I mean, it's you have those moments of kind of beating our head up against the wall and, asking, at the end of the day, has all this effort, has all this work, has, sort of this commitment, has it paid off? And I do think it's something that we have to attend to as religious educators, whether we're in high school or university or in a parish or whatever it might be, is that there's not a lot of immediate gratification to what we do, right? It's often those emails or those letters that we get from a student, that graduated 5, 10, 15 years ago, saying, hey, I don't know if I told you, but thank you, right? So what I hope to do today is maybe reframe things a little bit in a way that I think there's a lot of potential. And when we talk about the church and the world, I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of our curriculums, in terms of our educating, and in terms of our own personal formation. And so what I'm going to do is focus on three really basic questions. The first question that we'll look at, and I'll give these all up front. All right, we're going to walk through them though. The first is, are your students unchurched? We're going to deal with that question. Are your students unchurched? All right. The second question, which at least initially seems totally unrelated, is what happened at Vatican II? Right? What exactly went down? Here we are 50 years after its conclusion, 52 years after its conclusion almost on December 8th, and we're still asking that question. What happened? We kind of went through this pontificate of, Paul VI, and then we moved to John Paul II, then we moved to Benedict XVI, and quite frankly, some of the issues and concerns and, some of the tumultuousness of the Second Vatican Council has been brought back to the table again with the pontificate of Pope Francis. And really kind of interesting, he is the first Vatican II Pope, to be frank, right? I mean, he was ordained after the Second Vatican Council concluded. So, we got to ask the question, what actually happened there? What does it mean for us? And then I want to deal with this kind of really basic question, which is, is the church relevant to our students? Just, is the church relevant to our students? And I think as we go through, hopefully we'll be able to reframe this conversation a little bit, maybe look at these questions in a little bit of a different way, and quite frankly, come to terms with some of the challenges that we have to endure. So we'll jump right in. I'm going to ask you at your tables just to kind of answer that first question, right? Which is, are your students unchurched? And if you think they are, or if you think they're not, you think they are churched, why? Just in a really basic, I'm not asking for any kind of grand insights necessarily, but this is the context you deal with, right? Most of us are teaching theology. So are they churched or aren't they? And maybe a little bit of an explanation as to why you take the track that you do. So we'll take about 5 minutes just to... All right, let's go ahead and let's wrap up those conversations, and we'll jump into a group dialogue about this. So, generally speaking, some insights, into that really kind of fundamental question: are your students unchurched? What do you think? I love it. Raise your hand and then pass it off.
So my immediate thought when you asked us that question is well, what do you actually mean by church?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that mean for our Catholic students, for our non-Catholic students, for our non-Christian students?
Sure.
Because on all the different levels, it's just in my encounter with my students, that's a span of the whole spectrum.
Sure.
And so what do we actually mean by unchurched? We mean actual physical attendance in a church building? How often? We span from students who try to go to Mass on their own because their youth groups have encouraged them and have witnessed that during the week, to maybe.
Mm-hmm.
What's church? So
Sure.
that was my first question. What do we actually mean by that?
Okay. What do you think it means?
Well,
good presenter. Well,
right? Such a good presenter. What would church mean? I think there's the academic and then the transformative conversion piece. Someone who's encountered Jesus and someone who is just intellectual, and there's the distance between our mind and our hearts are 1,000 miles sometimes. So a church student, I would think, in my just initial thought, is someone who has the intellect and not the heart transformation.
Okay.
Potentially.
Okay. What else?
We have 20 years ago when I started, I would have said we would have most people were churched of some sort and 20-30% not unchurched. But over the past 20 years, our folk who are Baptist and Pentecostal and all that, they have disappeared. Their kids are now coming. They don't nothing. There's no school, no religious practice anymore for those kinds of things. I have even had kids say, "Oh, Christmas, that's not our holiday anymore." So, I mean, it has changed a lot in the past 20 years.
Okay. Good.
we have that whole spectrum of students too, Catholic practicing, Christian or denomination practicing or not. We have international students, places with center archbishops for Christians, so none of the above. And then, those that are part of the nuns, they don't describe it anything. But I think unchurched, for those people who are even participating in or attending the church, is part of the idea of not really identifying with belonging to the community.
Okay.
I go to this church and I mass, but I don't feel like I'm part of this international faith.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
And that relates to something that we talked a little bit about over here, of just asking me this question as opposed to asking them the question. Would they recognize that they're unchurched? That if you just you might know when to sit and stand, but if you scratch the surface, you really don't have a damn clue about what's going on. That is there that self-reflective piece that they would even recognize that there is that room to grow. Because I recognize it, and I would say, even though we have 85% of our students who identify as Catholic, how many qualify? It's kind of a different number.
Right. Any other thoughts? I want to take this category of unchurched, because even walking around, there seem to be a variety of investments in the term unchurched. Let's be honest, Catholic education, right, has changed in the last 20 years. You're absolutely correct, because Catholic education is no longer about the neighborhood Catholic community, right? It's moved, which is a testament to what we do educationally, first of all, right? especially here in the Northeast. We'll call it the Northeast, close enough, right? These pockets, this kind of cultural Catholicism that developed, at the turn of the 20th century especially, has done a remarkable job with very little. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. So one of the things I want to start by is saying, first and foremost, when we get a little discouraged, think of how much has been accomplished with so little. And it's a testament to what it is. It permeates, at least implicitly, I believe, what we do as Catholic educators. And so I think it's one of those little pieces that we have to hold on to. So I want us to take all this baggage about unchurched and push it off to the side for a second. Because I want to reframe it. And I want to say, I think sometimes that category of unchurched isn't really helpful. So I set us up for failure, right? What I want to do is walk through, the living generations. Okay, I want to start with the silent generation, kind of the pre-World War II, right? Many of them were indoctrinated into a cultural Catholicism. They went to a Catholic school that was part of their neighborhood, right? At this time, a lot of Catholic high schools were being developed, right, to serve kind of larger areas, but you see that kind of movement as well. And it very much is, if we're going to use the term, a churched society, right? At least a Catholic church that is churched. You go to Mass on Sunday, right? You know how to pray a novena, right? You're very aware of First Fridays. I mean, there's all this really important sort of stuff, right, that is handed on to this generation. They're called the silent generation for a reason, right? They're very obedient. There wasn't a lot of fist waving, right, to this generation. And I think it's something that we have to kind of think about. We move from the silent generation, which has kind of their own kind of characteristics, to this World War II greatest kind of generation, and from there we move to the baby boomers. Everything changes with the baby boomers. There's a few of us in here who are baby boomers, right? But a unique thing happens here, culturally speaking. It's a time of affluence. It's a time of moving out into the suburbs, right? It's moving away from the old neighborhoods into other areas. Families are sort of spread out a little bit more. And like I said, there's a tremendous amount of wealth. And I think it's kind of interesting because if you look scripturally, what happens to the Israelites every time they enter into a moment of prosperity? What do?
They forget God.
Yeah, right? Yeah, right? I mean, somehow they kind of take things for granted. They kind of move away. And I think, and not to beat up the baby boomers, but I think in many ways this is the context of baby boomers. Couple with that, the reality that education has become very accessible. Higher education has become very accessible, right? We start to regulate what is being taught in schools to make sure that standards are in place. In other words, baby boomers are not just, kind of the recipients of this thriving economy, right? This self-sufficiency. They're also very educated. Something changes there. And I think it's really important for us to recognize. They begin to ask questions. And I think the category of church does not necessarily mean that you're equipped to answer those questions. One of the things that I often hear is, the Baltimore Catechism. That died very quickly with the baby boomers. It wasn't a valid resource anymore. And part of that is because it's question and answer, right? But the questions that are being asked are not always the question the baby boomers were asking. They're self-reliant, right? All this prosperity. And you see this movement sort of away from being churched to unchurched. You also see this movement where the previous generations were just not equipped to answer their questions. They were not equipped to deal with the realities that the baby boomers were contending with. From there, we move to probably, and I can say this because I'm one of them, probably the most messed up generation, which is Generation X, right? Any Xers in here? All right, good. We can bond, right? Well, we're just utterly confused. But the Generation Xers really inherited this kind of situation, right? This unchurched, I can speak of my parents. My parents were unchurched. They, sort of removed themselves, but it wasn't as though they weren't thoughtful, but I don't know that my parents always knew how to articulate, some of the complexities of life, some of those kind of deep human longings and inklings, and where am I going, and what does it mean to be a good person, and those types of things. My parents are fantastic, but when I talk about, being able to kind of think deeply in a spiritual way, I don't know that they were given the tools and the resources to do that. And that's the generation that I inherited, right? Then we move to these millennials, and something changes. The millennials change the ballgame again. And what I mean by that is, if you look at studies of millennials, they have sort of spiritual sensibilities of older generations without the church sensibilities. There's this resurgence in the belief of life after death. There's a resurgence in the belief in God. There's a resurgence in the belief in heaven and hell. There's a resurgence in all these really kind of fundamental basic ideas that this is not the end, right? That there's something more. Something that, for, quite frankly, many baby boomers just disregarded. Not important. It's not the here and the now, right? I have everything I need. And it makes sense. The millennials dealt with things like school shootings. They dealt with things like, they came into a world after 9/11, right? They came into a world that had adversity that was quite a bit different than any of the previous generations have really had to contend with. So they ask different questions. Now we're on the cusp of a new generation, Generation Y. There's not enough data research to be able to show where they're going or what they're doing, right? But I think there's some things that we can infer if we look at how generations influence one generation after another. And one of them is that this next generation is probably going to inherit some of those religious sensibilities, or the spiritual sensibilities, right? If there's a battle cry for the millennials, it's, I am spiritual, but I'm not religious, right? In other words, I am spiritual, but I am not churched. And I don't know that I find a value in church. But we see with a lot of our young people, this, I'm going to call them Generation Y, there's this kind of grasping for religion. There's this grasping for church. There's this grasping for answers. But I think one of the things that we have to do, if we're going to be honest, and if we're going to move ahead, if we're going to meet the challenges that are confronting us, is learn from sort of, the pattern of history, which is, if we can't articulate our beliefs, our church, to their contemporary setting, then they'll remain unchurched, right? They'll remain non-religious. The group of the nuns will increase. And I think one of the things that we have at our disposal is a wealth of wisdom, a wealth of hope, right, of joy. We're a people of salvation. We're a salvific people. And it seems as though that's what our world is crying out for, and our young people, right? So one of the things the reason I go through this is, I think when we're teaching and when we're bringing material to our young people, your problems are not theirs. Your problems are not theirs, right? The baby boomers, in some ways, made Vietnam and the Cold War my issue, and it wasn't, right? The issues that we have with Generation X, with authority and other things, right, are not necessarily the issue of the millennials, but we've made it theirs. We've given it to them, right? So I think one of the things we need to do as educators is recognize where we are, right? What are my issues? And I mean culturally speaking, right? We're not going to get into the other ones. But we have to start engaging these. So here are some things. I don't want to get into these right now, right? but what are we going to do about gay marriage? What are we going to do about the changing context of families? What are we going to do about contraception? What are we going to do about racial discrimination? Right? These are all their problems. Right? For many of us, they're not problems, but they are for them. You know, you ask a young person, what irritates you about the church? And sometimes it's something to the effect of, well, it discriminates. Well, maybe we need to take a step back. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that our teaching has to change, right? In terms of the teaching of the church, our teaching has to change. The way we teach it, the way we engage, to recognize what are they really asking? Does that make any sense? Okay, so unchurched, let's push that aside. Because what we really don't have, and I think this goes all the way back to that first generation we talked about, we do not have a theologized church. There's a difference. We do not have a theologized church. My great aunts, ask them why they went to church. You know, my great aunt Irene would have been 100 in May, because that's what you're told to do. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, right? But that is not going to work for someone that falls into this generation Y, right? They didn't grow up that way. Why do you pray the rosary? Because it's what you do as a Catholic. I'm saying the rosary is a bad thing, right? Or we shouldn't be praying the rosary. But because I'm Catholic is not the response for someone in Generation Y. What is the theology? Remember, we have increased our education. We've increased our ability to reflect. We have time to do these things now. And, you know, as generations have sort of successively moved through, we have more and more time for recreation, for thought, reflection, and other things. And if we're not prepared to enter into that, you know, then we're going to run into some issues. So what does Vatican II have to do with any of this, right? So I want to ask the question, what happened at Vatican II? Because there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding, there's confusion, there's questions, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, I've researched the Vatican Council heavily. It's one of my favorite moments in history because it is just so complex, right? And remarkably simple at the same time, which is sort of kind of fun. So we're not going to go through all of it, but I'd like to just hit on a couple things that I think are important. So the Second Vatican Council happened at a time when we were moving away from churched to unchurched, right? And I think the Council Fathers recognized this. I think they anticipated it. I think they knew it was happening, or it was going to happen. Because what they encouraged us to do is move to a theologized church. If there's anything the Second Vatican Council did, and I'm convinced of this, it was a turn to theology. And I don't mean, you know, any new thing that comes along. I mean, it was a turn to talking about God in a rational, intelligent, faithful way. If you look at the council documents, they all affirm this. You look at the first, Sacrosanctum Concilium, you know, the Constitution on the Liturgy. Full active conscious participation. It's one of the central themes, right? And what does that mean? It means that the liturgy needs to adapt to the needs of the people. Because we don't do it just to go through the motions, we do it because we should be fully, consciously active at liturgy, because it's that important. You look at Dei Verbum, and it recognizes that scripture scholarship is really important. It's God's word in human words, and so you have to go back and you have to understand the author and the human context, right? The context of the world in which it arose. But it also reminded us that tradition is the same. You know, we talk about doing exegesis in terms of scripture, right? So that idea of leading out, right? And all these biblical criticisms and this kind of stuff, but we don't always apply the same principles to our tradition. But the council encourages us to do that. The council encourages us to go back and to reread and to think about it. In other words, handing on tradition means making it new here, right? And it means making who we are, our past, present in this reality. So, to say that, the first Council of Nicaea and the proclamation of homoousios, right, of the same substance, well, that's all good and fine, but what does it mean today? How do we talk about that in a way that's meaningful? We look at Gaudium et Spes, right? And the church affirms that the hopes and the joys and the sorrows and the sufferings and everything that it is to be human also belongs to the church. That it's not us versus the world, it's us in the world, right? This really kind of important movement that the church needs to discern the signs of the times. It needs to think deeply about where we are right now, right? In light of where we've been, but not in a way that excludes or demonizes or puts down where we are now. We see Lumen Gentium, and there's this really beautiful line that the church is a sacrament, right? A sign and an instrument. And I want to focus on that a little bit because this is a little bit of a break from the typical magisterium or the typical way that we teach about church previous to this, right? Church moves from primarily understood as an institution pre-Vatican II to this idea of sacrament post-Vatican II. In other words, the church is the contemporaneous, the current, the here and now in time and space presence of Jesus Christ in the world. Wow. Not 50 years ago. It's not the presence of Jesus Christ 50 years ago, right? I mean, it is, but in the here and the now, right? That's a real challenge. As soon as we affirm that the church is sacrament, it changes things in a really remarkable way because it means not only with Gaudium et Spes do we have to discern the signs of the times, but we also have to find ways of making Christ present in the here and the now. And that's a really tall order, right? So the way that maybe it was appropriate to bring Christ present, in 1950 might not be the way to bring Christ present, to make Christ present, visible, right? A visible reality in 2017. Maybe we need to rethink some of that. So, Avery Dulles. Do we know Avery Dulles? Have you heard? Okay, that classic models of church, right? He says there are 5 models of church. I'm not going to get into the 6th one, the one that he put in it. Side note for a second. Avery Dulles writes this book, The Models of Church, and he comes up with 5 models, right? And then later on, he makes a 2nd edition where he's like, maybe what I should have done is added a 6th model where I took all the good things from all the other ones and put them together into a final model. So, but he says this, that throughout history, we can talk about church as institution, we can talk about church as mystical communion, we can talk about church as sacrament, we can talk about church as a herald, and we can talk about church as a servant. The Second Vatican Council did all of those. But 2 of them are really unique, and I want to focus on those because I think this is what the Council Fathers wanted us to do as we move ahead in the future. And that is the church is a sacrament and the church is a servant. Those are remarkably unique and flushed out in the documents in a way that some of the others aren't, right? They're all there. They all kind of come together. But sacrament and servant are really important. If you look at the first of all of those, it's always the church acting on the world. The church is an institution that acts on the world. It is the church and the world, right? There's a distinction, okay. Mystical communion, right? It is this church guided by the Spirit, these internal sensibilities that has this obligation to transform the world. You look at the church's sacrament, right? That we're sign and instrument, right? We make Christ present to the world. You look at herald, right? It is our job to preach the gospel to the world. I'm not saying any of those are bad. It's all subject-object relationships. The church is the active subject, the world is the passive object, right? We're doing the work. The church is doing the work. The servant kind of undoes that a little bit, at least challenges us to think a little bit differently. Because in order to be a servant, right, you're talking about 2 subjects. The world is no longer an object, it's a subject. And one of the ways that I like to articulate this is think of it this way. Anybody ever been a waiter or a waitress? Yes. So what do you need to do to be a good waiter or waitress? What's that? Got to please the folks. You're absolutely right. But how do you do that? Smile, okay. Say hello. Anticipate their needs. Listen, right? Think about this for a second. A good waiter or waitress comes up to a table and says, hello, my name is, right? This is who I am. I'll be taking care of you. Kind of said, this is what I do, right? What would you like? What do you need, right? Takes the order and then gives them what they need. All right. Now imagine if, the servant model was one of the others, subject-object. Your waiter or waitress would come over to you and say, you look like you need a Coke. You're going to have fish. And a big bloody steak for you, right? I mean, how many of us would feel like, all right, good service, right? And it's almost as though the church kind of had this like aha moment, at the Second Vatican Council, which was maybe if we ask people what they need and want, maybe if we're attentive to the needs of other people, that we can kind of enter into a little bit more of a fruitful dialogue, right? And I think when we talk about sacrament and we talk about servant, I think there are two primary ways that the Second Vatican Council asked us to enter into the world. We absolutely make Christ present. If you don't believe that, get out of the business, right? But I also have to recognize that in order to make Christ present in the here and the now, I have to know the people I'm dealing with. I have to understand their needs. I have to be attentive to where they are. Doesn't mean I can't say, I want you to be here, but I also have to be attentive to where they are. One of my favorite examples of this kind of thinking, and again, I think Francis has rocked the boat a little bit, is the Synod on the Family. There was a big argument that broke out, right? And it all had to do with this, and I'm going to just water this down. There is a bar for marriage. Man and a woman, lifelong, right? Open to children, those types of things. Make sense? I mean, we all know that. That's our teaching. That's the bar we strive for, right? That's the bar of marriage. The question is, if we fall below the bar, have we failed? Or is it our job as a church to lead people to the bar? That was the fundamental tension at the Synod on the Family. Was what do we do with the bar? Is it the bar to strive for? Or is it the bar in which measures success or failure, right? And I think there's good arguments on both ends. I mean, you can hear someone saying, look, I don't know that I can say that every time I've had intercourse with my spouse that it has been unitive and procreative, but that's the bar. So does that mean that my marriage is bad and it's failed, right? On the other side, you can see well, if you're not open to having children, that's an issue for us in terms of what we believe marriage is about. It's procreative, it's unitive, right? You can see both logics. I'm not arguing one way or the other. But I think what Francis has done has said, as servant, and he embodies that idea of servant in many ways, it's about hearing people and leading them to the bar, meeting them where they are, and trying to get there. And it's a shift. I do think it's in line with the Second Vatican Council. I think it is what they sort of thought about. One of my favorite moments at the Second Vatican Council is all these theologians and bishops are arguing about sort of the nitty-gritty details, and Paul VI comes out and gives them a little bit of a talking to. And he's like, look, you're not going to figure it all out. That's the task of future generations. Let's let them do it, right? And so as a result, there are no canons, there are no creeds from the Second Vatican Council. There is no, this is it, right? Every other council has those, at least canons. So if you want to know what that council really wanted to say, look at the canon, right? Those are kind of like the footnotes, or the, not the footnotes, what are those called? The Smart Notes, thank you. Spark Notes, there we go. When I was a kid, it was something different. What were they called? Cliff Notes, thank you. I never read Cliff Notes. But
You friend.
So the Second Vatican Council, I think, propels us in a particular direction. And it propels us towards a church that is theologized. Because it recognizes that an intellectual community also has to have good intellectual reasons for doing what they do. Maybe the old way doesn't work exactly the way the new way does. How are we doing so far? Good? On par, off, base?
Birdie.
Just, what's that?
A birdie or eagle.
A birdie or an eagle? Okay, I'll take either of them. Thoughts so far? Just curious.
I think, knowing your people is essential. When I graduated from college and started teaching in the mid-'80s, it was rarely did I even have divorced parents, students in my classroom. Then we had the first wave of that. Then I had interracial parents. Now I have a young woman who has 2 moms.
Right.
How do I teach Christian lifestyles in all those different entities?
Right.
Without knowing them and being respectful to them.
And that becomes the tension, right? Yeah. Is our culture tells us we have to be respectful and open to everything, and but our teaching sets up parameters and limits, right? I do this with college students, and this is kind of the next thing that I'm going into is our students all want to be postmodern. I think postmodernity is a myth because they will all fall into modern sensibilities. And what I mean by that is postmodern says, live and let live. You do what you do, I do what I do. Everything's good, it's okay, but none of us actually live that way. And I asked them the question, how many of you think that parents have the right to discipline their children as they please? And everyone raises their hand. And then I ask a follow-up question, how many of you think it's okay to yell at your child? And about 2 of them won't raise their hand. And then I'll ask, how many of you think it's okay to smack your child? And about half the class raises their hand. And I say, how many of you think it's okay to hit your child with an extension cord? And no one raises their hand. In other words, I come down somewhere, and I will stand there, right? I don't think that's okay. So we start off wanting to be this way, but I think just walking through the intellectual progression, it's like, well, maybe I do need to stand somewhere. And do we do that with our students in terms of faith, right? That doesn't mean that I have to condemn, ostracize, and push aside the parent who I believe made a bad choice, right? That's not necessarily what I say, but it doesn't mean that I have to condone, discipline in this manner either, right? So it's a difficult reality. All right, still doing okay? Yeah? All right. What, 11:15?
It ends at 11:30.
11:30, good, okay. I thought it was like way over.
And then Dr. Ed wanted to leave some time for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into this final question. So I'm going to reframe the relevance question. How is the church today a sign, an instrument, a sacrament for young people? How is it a sign and an instrument? I'm going to take everything we've done and I'm going to put it into 3 basic categories. We have moved from pre-modern to modern. Postmodernity, I believe, is a myth. And I think where our students are is what I would call kind of post-critical. I think they're in a phase that we would call post-critical. And it can manifest itself in a couple different ways. One of the ways that post-criticism manifests itself is, I don't care. Postmodernity cares about a lot. Modernity certainly cares about particular things. The pre-modern is, this is what you're to care about, right? So think of it this way. The pre-modern world doesn't mean they're not critical, right? But in a pre-modern world, here are the things that are outside of the realm of criticism. So you don't criticize the Bible, you don't criticize your tradition, you don't criticize the priest, you don't criticize Aristotle, you don't do any of those. These are kind of the sacred cows, right? That's sort of pre-modern. Modernity comes along and it's like, no, you can criticize everything, right? And the modern idea is beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So you doubt until you can't doubt anymore, and then it must be true, right? Postmodernity says, well, hey, we're the ones doing the doubting. So it's just modernity turned in on itself, which says you can't even trust your doubting. So now you have to doubt. Right? That's why I say it's just sort of, in some ways, it's just kind of ridiculous, right? It tears everything down. So postmodernity likes to leave things kind of in ruins, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. You know, tear it down, criticize it, I mean, beat it up, but you got to build it up again. And I think that's where our students are. And many of our young people are in this post-critical phase. I get the criticism. You know, I'm speaking for them. I get the criticism. I get why we do this. But you haven't given me anything to care about. Right? And in order to do that, we have to speak their language. Because what they care about is not what you care about, necessarily, in the same way. Right? So how do we do that? I think it centers around this concept of mystery. I think our youngest people are millennials to a certain extent, but I think our youngest students really understand mystery. They get how to walk through a messy and strange world. They know how to navigate it in a way that many of us don't. Right? They can hold together the tension of two moms, two dads, mom and dad, mom and three other partners, and whatever. I mean, they can walk through that, the ambiguity, right? So I want to clarify what I mean by mystery, because the Second Vatican Council affirms that the church is a mystery. In the ancient Eastern tradition, they have a better kind of understanding than we do. So one way we use mystery is like a mystery novel, right? So what's the purpose of a mystery novel? Figure it out, right? That's a problem, it's not a mystery. Those are problem novels, actually. Problems have a definite solution, right? The other is on the other side, which is you'll never know it. It's unknowable, it's out there. So don't break your head over it. Don't even think about it, right? To some extent, I'm picking on the baby boomers, that's a baby boomer response. Don't even worry about it, right? It's just, you'll never figure it out. But when we talk about mystery, theologically speaking, which is the source, in many ways, of all theology, it's what is infinitely knowable. It's infinitely knowable. That means that I can know something. I just can't know it all. And I'll never know it all. That means that every time I take a step towards the horizon, I've moved towards the horizon, but the horizon has moved as well. I'll never grab onto the horizon. But that doesn't mean I haven't moved towards it. It doesn't mean in my movement I haven't encountered God. I haven't encountered, through my experience, something very important. But everything that I've encountered cannot encapsulate the horizon that's in front of me. And I think this is what the church was kind of getting at. This is why there's no creeds and canons. It's not because it's all mystery and don't even try. It's because we're a church. We're a pilgrim church. We're constantly moving. And so what do we do with that? How do we move towards the horizon, right? And so I think our students, I've begun to see this at the university level, which means it's been coming up through the high school, right? Is they get that. They get the ambiguity. They live with it. And they seem to be okay with it in a way that previous generations haven't been. It can look like apathy, but I don't think that's what it is. I think they're able to walk through a world a little bit differently than many of us are able to.
Is there a reality? Because if you have two moms, it just is what it is.
It is what it is, and if you talk to that student, right, and this is what I mean by the ambiguity, you talk to that student, and how many of them would say, yeah, I think it's wrong? You know, because their encounter is, they know it's not the norm, right? I mean, they've looked around, they've seen it. They've encountered that. But on the flip side, I guarantee they've also encountered a lot of love and support and encouragement. And how do you know, so in other words, when we throw at them something that is clean cut, easy, and simple, it's like, well, this does not jive with my kind of jumbled up experience of the world, right? In other words, how do we engage the mystery of God's presence in the world in a way that is faithful, right, to how we understand church? And I'm not encouraging us to dismiss our doctrine. That's not what I'm saying, right? But one of my favorite lines is by my hero, Karl Rahner, when he talks about doctrine and dogma. It is a point, right? And it's a really important point because it's a moment of arrival where after generations of thoughtful reflection and intense prayer and all kinds of other activity, we've been able to say something about God, human beings, and creation. But dogma is never a point. It also goes out in the other direction, which is now how is that lived? What other doorways does that open up, right? Because if it remains a point, then it's dead. It becomes a monolith in a museum, right? But we believe we believe our doctrine and our dogma is a living reality, right? So how do we do that, right? And that becomes sort of that tension. And I think that's why Rahner's understanding of it is really helpful. It doesn't dismiss the past achievement, but it also doesn't lose sight of, but it didn't end there. Right? Now we've got to begin to talk about this. Yeah, please.
Doesn't that really fit in then to Pope Francis's missionary evangelization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that Francis has been sort of critiqued on is his lack of theological prowess, right? Like he is not like John Paul, who was, he wrote in a theologically astute way. I mean, you read Fides et Ratio, and it's like, that could have been a textbook, right? I mean, it's beautiful, very thoughtful, right? You read Benedict, and clearly, a brilliant academic mind. They're both pastors too. I'm not trying to say they're not. But Francis is he can sometimes look as though he's not theological because he kind of says really simple things, right? But I think it comes out of a theology, if that makes any sense. I think he gets that. So his missionary impulse, right, is out of a deep conviction and a thoughtful conviction as to this is how we move into the world, right? We meet people where they are and love them for who they are, because there's a lot of pain and suffering there. And as a salvific people, we're called to enter into the places of suffering to bring salvation, right? If we're going to be the presence of Christ, we need to be the presence of Christ amidst pain and suffering. Yeah. Thoughts? I'm curious. What are the challenges that you face? I could speak all day, but
one of the big thoughts I had in my mind was, it seems like the world keeps changing and changing fast. But it does give me hope to think about how St. Paul had to deal with all these things that were changing really,
sure.
really fast.
Mm-hmm.
When St. Paul did it, we can do it too. It sounds really cliche and boring, but one thing is true is that people and our worldviews and perspectives haven't stopped changing.
Right.
And then I can't remember his name, James Allen.
Okay.
He has this thing where he's like, if you take a dart and you throw it on the spectrum of the history of Catholicism, you're always on the brink of great chaos and destruction. We think things are going to end, but great hope.
Right.
We think it's the worst, but it's also we might have some great hope too. So I think part of the thing is when I talk with my really intellectual students, they are just able to think and think and think, and they're at a point where I can dialogue with them about the mystery of God, and that we can just rest in the tension together and be in awe of the tension and mystery of God.
Right.
You're right. They at an age like 15 years old are starting to realize that like, you know, like some things just like are a mystery, and that there's a beauty in that mystery.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and travel along. I mean, encourage the movement into the mystery, right? Which I think is actually kind of frightening for us. I'll be honest. You know, when a student comes in and they throw something at me that is off of my radar screen, I mean, the first thing I want to do is I want to frame it in the categories that I'm good at, you know, and then all of a sudden I'm not listening anymore, and I become the subject, they become the object. I'm doing all this sort of judging instead of, you know, kind of just taking it, right? Now there are times when you have to do that, of course. I'm not, but at the same time too, I think reframing, hearing, seeing things, you know, from a little bit of a different point of view is absolutely essential for our context. And culture is changing rapidly. You know, one of the places that we struggle with change, believe it or not, is the university. Oh my goodness. You want to change something, you've got to have 9 committees. It's got to be approved through 28 different people, and you know, and all you wanted to do was, you know, put a recycling can somewhere.
The other thing I think is interesting, again, a shift from mid-'80s to today, but, you know, to memorize things was a part of my education. You had to know these things.
Sure.
Well, guess what? I can Google it today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, like, to know facts, we
Right.
need to know the dates of the major councils? Nope, I can look it up and find it like that.
Right, right.
You know, but do I need to have that understanding and that relationship?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
I had one of our vice principals say, don't worry about the facts, worry about, you know, what's going on.
Right, right.
And that was like, gosh, I mean, it's that whole notion that so much has shifted and changed.
Right, right.
in
Yeah.
Technology.
Yeah, and the way we've been forming our students, you know, Pennsylvania, we had some issues just because of, you know, standardized testing and some other things, and you know, that's sort of eased up, but you could see how that affected students. I mean, all they wanted to know is, and I never heard this before, Dr. Dart, what's the prompt? And I just looked at him, I'm like, I have no freaking idea what a prompt is, right? But it became a language that, you know, and it's like, just let me know the prompt. And, you know, our overachievers are like, what exactly did I do wrong here? Well, it's not that you did it wrong, you didn't address this. Oh, so it was, no, you did a really nice job, but, you know, this was missing, you know, and just trying to get them to see that, right? One of the things I think is really important is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, though, right? Which is, I've heard that a lot too. Don't worry about the facts, because what you need to do is think through it. Well, you know, when I teach scripture as an example, I try to get them, it's like, know the story, right? Know how it unfolds, because then things kind of, but there has to be sort of a meeting point, right? You have to be able to, for example, you know, Jesus is Lord and Christ. You know, I mean, that's, now what does it mean, you know, but yeah, that kind of stuff.
Because how can you think deeply about something if you have never internalized even the smallest
Right.
part
Right.
of it? The one comment too that I thought when you said that post-critical phase, some of them, they don't care. That's kind of their reaction. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Okay. I think a lot of that comes because all of this technology and everything that they have in the pace of the world,
Mhm.
they're so overwhelmed that they're just withdrawing from, and that's why we have so many escapist things, but I've heard so many students that they can't grasp all that's there. They can't care about every single hurricane. They
Right.
can't care about every single, and it's
Yeah.
thrown at
Yeah, yeah,
them,
yeah.
you know, 24/7 now on
Right.
their phone, and so they just shut.
Yeah. I call that-
I think that's where that I don't care is kind of coming from.
Oh, absolutely. And I call that
Yeah.
the Holden Caulfield syndrome. Catcher in the Rye, do we know that book? Do you know? I don't want to give away the ending, but there's this scene in the book that resonates with me, and I think it's, you know, the book is really prophetic. Holden Caulfield's, there's a scene where he is really worried about the ducks in the park because winter is coming and what's going to happen to the ducks. Right? He's just like overwhelmed with concern for the ducks. And at the end of the book, I'm sorry, I have to, because if you haven't read it, then that's your own damn fault, because you should have read it, you find out that he had a nervous breakdown, right? He's in a mental institution. And one of the final lines of the book is, the ducks can take care of themselves. It's, this realization that that's dealing with the mystery. I don't know how the ducks are going to make it south, but somehow they do, right? And I don't have to know every little piece of it. So
going along with that, I'm just wondering, what do other people do in teaching when you encounter that? I had a student twice now tell me exactly what I need to do so I can get to say it. Everybody's probably encountered that. So going along with the mystery, I try to impart that on them, but I can say it so I'm blue in the face. But what other techniques do people do to get to be okay with the mystery?
it's a
Looking for techniques.
give you a really good.
They have to know fundamental theology. If they don't know, like, fundamental Catholic theology, like, I have to get them there first. Like, so there's like memorization and dates and facts.
You need to know the recipe.
You gotta know the recipe, but then.
At least the ingredients.
Yeah. Well, after that, I say, listen, like, because they always say, like, how many sentences I have to write? How many of this? How many of that? I say, you can write one sentence and blow my mind.
Yeah.
You have an A+. You can write 10 sentences and you still have a 0 because you didn't say anything.
Yeah. Now, to give you an example, and this is where I think the Vatican II documents are so beautiful, because if you read Gaudium et Spes, how does it start off? It starts off with this very intense, fundamental anthropological theology, right? About the human condition and what it means to be human and all this other kind of stuff, in order to say at the end that basically, look, the church responds to that. It belongs to the church as well. The pain and the suffering and the hopes and the joys and the salvation that you encounter and all those, we believe all belongs to the church, and that death isn't the final end, right? That pain and suffering isn't going to have the final say, that ultimately it's life and resurrection. Well, what is resurrection? Even the scriptures don't tell us. No one saw the resurrection, right? So it always retains this sense of mystery. But how do we enter into it, right? Do we give them the tools in order to be able to do that? And you're also talking developmentally as well. You're going to have a really hard time doing this with a freshman in high school. You want them to think, a mile deep about something. Just, they're still going through puberty, right? I mean, they're still coming to terms with the reality of their body, and not to sound goofy about it, but that's where they are, right? You talk about a high school or a senior in high school who is now looking at college, who is making life decisions, who's trying to come, at least minimally. Those are two very different entrance points into this complexity of life, right? So I always tell people, hey, puberty is not a bad place to begin the conversation about mystery with high school students. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on, and it's happening. I know it's happening, but I don't know exactly what's happening. That's mystery. It's infinitely knowable, right? This is happening. You're talking about college student, looking for college. You don't know how all that's going to turn out, and yet you're working towards, right? I know I have a sense. I'm looking for something. I know what I might want to do, and those are moments where, guidance counselors, as an example, right? They enter into the mystery of the person and try to lead them through it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think something that I think about too with this, our kids don't have time to reflect. Like that whole concept. And so we ask them to do these like compare, contrast things or whatnot, but we project them into the future so often. Guidance counselors, college, courses for next semester, what is their sports season looking like? They're always thinking forward because we have to push ahead. And they're so attached to their phones and responding in the here and now and what's going to happen tomorrow versus taking the time to think about and process through and chew on, like they almost don't have the skills, some of them, to actually chew on that and say, what does this actually mean? Because they would rather someone tell them.
Right.
And move, like, let's move on and let's move forward.
Right.
And one of the things that we've been trying to do in some of the things at our school is trying to teach them about the meaning of reflection and giving them the tools to be intentional in their actions. That their actions, they're not just doing it to check off a box, which a lot of them are.
Yeah.
But trying to chew on that, how can we encourage them to be more reflective, because that's where the connections between heart and head
Right.
happen. And when
Right.
they chew on that and be able to ask the questions, or like the aha moments come when they're had those times, that if we give it importance, we can help them to give the reflection piece importance.
Right.
But as adults too, we're so forward thinking and thinking ahead to our next lesson plan
Right.
and thinking next to our committee after school and whatever else.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I remember very clearly in high school, I was a sophomore, and my theology teacher came in, and our assignment that day was to write our worldview. I think, I remember just looking dumbfounded at that question, and I remember thinking, this is just ridiculous. Like, I don't know, worldview? Like, what's, I just want to go to my girlfriend's house tonight, that's kind of what, where many of us are, right? Even some college students have a difficult time with that. But, the question is, I think, think of all the things that are presupposed in a question like, what is your worldview? That's how we get them to start entering into mystery, right? We got to get back to some of those really fundamental things, which is, what do you think about relationships, right? Reflecting on friendships, right? What is a deep and meaningful friendship for you right now, right? Asking the questions about race. There are all kinds of things that we back off of, I think, because we're afraid that we're going to step into a hornet's nest. And, well, yeah, we're going to. The world is a hornet's nest, right? And it's not clean and easy and simple. And that means doing it in a way that's respectful, of course, and finding ways to do that, but entering into the complexity.
The relationship that we have with kids, we all know how important that is. And I don't think we can forget that we're not just sharing our faith, we're sharing our confusions.
Oh, absolutely.
Too.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that helps a little bit to let them know, well, God, she's not half bad. And
Right.
we like her, and
Right.
she seems to care about us. And if she was confused about something, especially when she was a full-grown adult and she shared that with me, that gives me hope that I can rest a little bit more with this
Right.
ambiguity and not be so nuts about it.
Oh, absolutely. And think of, I know we're running out of time, but I just want to share this with you is, I remember I went to a Catholic grade school, right? And it was in a Catholic high school. I cannot tell you how influential and important those realities were for me, right? Because there were things that happened there that just did not happen at home. But there was also a confluence between the two, right? The love and the respect and the concern and the commitment and all those things that I experienced at home, I was able to articulate or at least get language in order to be able to talk and think about it. And I'm eternally grateful for that. I thought I was going to be a computer engineer. Go figure, right? Now I'm teaching theology. But I do remember, and this is where I think the crux of all of this comes down, and why respecting mystery becomes so important, and why we need to think through it very deeply. So my mother had me when she was young, met my dad after I was born, so always had a dad. Never remember a time when I did not have a dad, right? Biological dad, no idea, don't care, right? Never a part of my life. But everybody knew that he was not my biological dad, because in 8th grade, I was exactly the height I am now, and my dad is 5'6" and chubby as hell, right? I mean, like, there is no resemblance at all. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, right? But there was a lot of judgment that I kind of encountered because of that, because I came from now this is 30 years ago, whatever, you know, our context has changed a little bit, but it was difficult for me to appropriate, you know, how is it that we talk about love and salvation and all this other kind of stuff, which I'm attracted to. I believe it. It makes sense. It's good. It's, you know, and also encountering in the same place judgment, right? When I go home and I experience the love and the concern, I experience all those things we talk about here, but somehow this isn't necessarily, you know, the right. You know, and you know, think about what some of our students grow up with, just even in terms of anxiety and you know, that those issues revolving around judgment, that kind of stuff. And I think what the Second Vatican Council ultimately asks us to do is not let go of any of our doctrine, our beliefs, that kind of a thing, push ahead towards something that maybe is a little fuller. Maybe, you know, gets in tune with, you know, that salvific impulse that's supposed to be within all of us. You know, I know it's cliche, but Jesus did hang around with tax collectors and prostitutes, right? Those seemed to be his choice people, and his disciples were anything but, you know, stand up at times. So, you know, what does that call us to do? So, closing thoughts, anybody?
I just have this thought. So I was just gonna write down, if Jesus hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes, I can certainly hang out with teenagers.
Better you than me. Hey, thank you so much. I hope it was somewhat helpful.